Richard Prosser.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I'm pleased to rise on behalf of New Zealand First to take a call on the second reading of the Keep Kiwibank Bill. New Zealand First supports this bill. Mr Speaker, I note that the member in charge of this bill has changed. Mr Cosgrove was the member who brought the bill to the House, but now I see that it appears Mr Parker has taken the reins. It's a good thing, Mr Speaker, that the bill remains a Keep Kiwibank bill, because it's obvious that it's no longer a Keep Clayton bill. And I have no issue with that, Mr Speaker. Mr Parker is a fine upstanding member, and I'm sure he will make a splendid job of shepherding this bill through all its remaining stages. That's not to say that Mr Cosgrove is not also a fine member, Mr Speaker. He has made a lengthy and I'm sure many people believe valuable contribution to this House. He's valiantly held off the challenge from myself in the Waimakariri seat for the last two elections, succumbing obviously to Mr Ducey and Ms Wilkinson before him, but he's obviously managed to keep just ahead of me, and I don't blame him for wanting to take that challenge on a third time. And we wish him well in whatever endeavours await him beyond these halls, Mr Speaker. So, the Finance and Expenditure Committee has recommended by majority that the bill not be passed, Mr Speaker, and this is hardly surprising. It's not a surprise that the national-dominated Finance and Expenditure Committee should want to keep the door open as far as a sale of Kiwibank is concerned. The committee's report states that the bill raises a fundamental issue. It says, and I quote, "The means by which this bill seeks to ensure that Kiwibank continues to be owned by the New Zealand people raises an important constitutional issue. What it proposes would legislatively entrench New Zealand Post Limited's ownership of Kiwibank Limited. Entrenchment restricts the future ability of the legislature to decide matters by simple majority, and the majority of us believe that it should therefore be used for provisions of a constitutional nature. Currently, entrenched or reserved provisions are found only in the Electoral Act 1993 and the Constitution Act 1986. The truth, of course, Mr Speaker, is that the Nats simply want to give themselves some wiggle room in case they decide, or actually for when they decide, that they're going to flog off Kiwibank, no matter how many times they insist that they're not. I mean, they say, the committee's reports, the majority National Committee's report, well, National and their little friend from the Epsom Tea Party, it says that the means by which this bill seeks to ensure that Kiwibank continues to be owned by the New Zealand people raises an important constitutional issue. What it proposes would legislatively entrench New Zealand Post Limited's ownership of Kiwibank Limited. Well, yes, it does, Mr Speaker. It does seek to ensure that Kiwibank continues to be owned by the New Zealand people. But I don't know that the issue raised is of particular constitutional significance. The report does say entrenchment restricts the future ability of the legislature to decide matters by simple majority, and the majority of us believe that it should therefore be used only for provisions of a constitutional nature, which it could be argued was significant. But as we all know, Mr Speaker, no parliament can bind a future parliament. And an entrenched provision, which requires a three-quarters majority of the House in order to be overturned, can itself be overturned by a simple majority. So any future parliament, or indeed this one, Mr Speaker, could use a simple majority to simply remove the entrenchment provision and then another simple majority to make whatever other changes it felt like. So actually, entrenchment of itself does not restrict the legislature, now or in the future. It is merely one more procedural matter to be overcome as necessary, and not a particularly onerous one at that. So that's a cop-out, Mr Speaker. And of course, now they have sold off, or they're going to sell off nearly half of Kiwibank, 45% of it to themselves. Government selling off 45% of Kiwibank to ACC and the super fund, which means that it is still in New Zealand ownership, government ownership, as Ms Lee pointed out. But there's nothing stopping either of those two entities from on-selling them their stakes at some stage in the future, which is obviously the matter that the supplementary order paper seeks to address, against, obviously, protestations again from the government that they would do no such thing. Then, of course, the government can turn around and say, well, we didn't sell it off, it was ACC or the board of super fund or whatever, and we can't tell them what to do. So that's a cop-out too, Mr Speaker. At best, it is very cynical. It would be an elegant deception if indeed it was elegant, but it's not. It's transparent and cynical, and actually rather clumsy, I have to say. In fact, the report also says, some of us believe the danger that Kiwibank will be partially or wholly privatised by the current government remains a risk. Well, that's an eminently valid concern for them to hold, Mr Speaker, and one that's reinforced by this government's decision not to support this bill. If they were genuine with their stated intention of not selling off Kiwibank, they'd have no problem supporting the bill, Mr Speaker. But as always with this government, when it comes to putting their money where their mouth is, they suddenly have commitment issues. Then they say there could be other ways of achieving the bill's policy objectives without raising an issue which is so fundamental to our constitutional democracy. Like what? Perhaps some members opposite might like to suggest a few. They haven't explored those options, the report says, but anyone who cares to do so might like to do that for themselves. Well, that's reassuring, Mr Speaker, or not. Mr Speaker, this is a short, simple bill which does deal with reassurance, a reassurance from the government that they do not intend to sell off Kiwibank, and it is apparent that this is a reassurance that they are not prepared to give, precisely because it is not actually an intention that they hold, Mr Speaker. They do want to flog it off. They're philosophically opposed to New Zealand and New Zealanders owning anything. Everything must be privatised, everything must be sold off to their financial backers in China. The state must most certainly not own anything on behalf of the people when some private foreign corporation could be owning it and making a profit out of it off the backs of ordinary hard-working New Zealanders, Mr Speaker. And that is why they will not support this bill. While New Zealand First does support it, Mr Speaker, we are proud to support it, and Mr Parker and the Labour opposition can take some comfort from the fact that in a year and a half, the next government, which will be a New Zealand First dominated government in some shape, form or another, will take the steps necessary to ensure that this bill's aims are met. And if they've flicked it off in the meantime, we'll be taking it back. And the speculators and the carpetbaggers who come grasping for a share of it won't be getting a cent more than what they pay, and they'll be getting less than that if its value has diminished under private ownership. So any potential investors, or perhaps it should be co-conspirators, might like to bear that in mind if and when the Nats do in fact bring Kiwibank to the auctioneer's block. Mr Speaker, New Zealand First supports this bill. Thank you.
Order. Mr Speaker.
Order. Before I call a member, I just want to ask Mr Scott.
I wasn't on the phone, sir.
You're giving a very good impression, putting it by your ear. Okay.
Mr Speaker.
Andrew Bailey.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.